Yo, what's going on guys? Welcome back. In today's video we'll be going over exactly how you can set up an enclosure for a Western hognose, as well as inform you about all of their care requirements. This video is a complete care guide for you, so let's get straight into it. Before they're set up, let's start with the enclosure. Now, hognose snakes don't need a massive enclosure, but they do love their ground space considering they're a terrestrial species. But on top of that, they also love to dig and burrow. So therefore, you want an enclosure that provides more length to it rather than an enclosure that provides more height. Now, for a baby hognose, I'd recommend keeping them in a small container. Now, the reason being is baby hognoses can get stressed out quite easily, especially if you give them too big of an enclosure too soon. So by giving them a small container to live in at this stage of life, they're going to feel a lot more secure and safe in this container. And once they move to a juvenile sort of size, that's when you could move them up to something like this, which is a 2 by 1.5 foot by 1.5 foot vivarium. And for an adult hognose snake, I'd recommend getting something like this. Now, this is a 3 foot length by 1.5 foot deep by 1.5 foot high vivarium. Now, this size enclosure is going to allow your hognose snake to live comfortably, whether it's a male or a female. Alternatively, if you don't want to use a vivarium, you could also use a terrarium with a mesh top, and this is just down to personal preference. Personally, I prefer using the vivariums, but as long as your enclosure is wide enough to allow your snake to fully stretch out and move around, then you're going to be perfectly fine. So now you've got a good idea of what size enclosure you're going to want. The next thing that we're going to talk about is heating and lighting. So to begin with, let's focus on the heating system. So for their heating, the first thing that you're going to want is one of these, which is a ceramic lamp holder. And then once you have your ceramic lamp holder, simply install it to one side of your vivarium. And if you've gone for the mesh enclosure rather than a vivarium, then I'd recommend getting one of these, which is just a dome lamp, and simply just place it on top of the enclosure to one side of the enclosure. Then the next thing that you're going to need is the bulb itself. Now, the wattage of your bulb will depend on a few factors. For example, the temperature in your room that your snake is going to be living in. This will play a part in which wattage you're going to be needing. What I'd recommend doing is starting off with either a 50 watt or 75 watt halogen or spot lamp. What I would suggest doing is testing your temperatures though with one of the wattages, and if you're not getting the temperatures that you're looking for, I would recommend changing the wattage of the bulb. And this is going to be a little game of trial and error for you. For example, let's say you started off with a 50 watt halogen and you found that the temperatures aren't hot enough, then simply change to a 75 watt and you'll probably find that the temperatures will rise a bit and it'll be more at the ideal temperature range. And then obviously vice versa, if you try the 75 watts and it's too hot, then try dropping down to a 50 watt and you'll probably find that the temperature will reduce down to the right sort of temperature range. So once you have your bulb, simply just install it into your heat lamps. Now, the reason why that you want it on one side of the enclosure is because you're going to be creating a hot side and also a cold side. The next thing that you're going to need is one of these, which is a lamp guard protector, and simply just install this over the bulb. Now, what this is going to do is it's going to prevent your snake from being able to actually wrap themselves around this bulb, and this is going to avoid direct contact with the bulb itself. So it's just a bit of extra protection to prevent your snake from getting burnt. So that's basically everything that you need to know regarding their heating. So let's now move on to their lighting. So for their lighting, I'd recommend getting yourself one of these, which is a 7% 8 watt T5 UVB shade dweller. One of these is going to be perfect for your hognose snake. Now, what I would simply do is install it to one side of the enclosure. Typically, we'll keep that on the side of your heat lamp, and basically you want half of the enclosure covered with the UVB, and then you want the other half of the enclosure to be basically light free to allow that darker area for your hognose to go to. On top of that, if you are planning on going for live plants inside the enclosure, then I'd also recommend adding a LED light like this one. This is a Jungle Dawn by Arcadia, and again, simply install that to one side of your enclosure. And obviously, if you're using the terrarium rather than the vivarium, then you're simply going to just be placing the items on the top of the enclosure to one side of that enclosure. So that's everything that you need to know regarding their lighting. So now let's actually go back to their care requirements and let's talk about their temperature and humidity requirements. So for their basking spot temperature, this is the area directly underneath the heat lamp. This temperature range is going to be between 32 degrees Celsius to 37 degrees Celsius, which is 90 degrees Fahrenheit to 98 degrees Fahrenheit. Which means that the ambient hot side temperature, which is the area surrounding your bulb on the hot side of the enclosure, this temperature is going to be roughly between 30 and 35 degrees Celsius, which is 86 to 95 Fahrenheit. Now, as you move across the enclosure towards the cooler end of the enclosure, this temperature is going to drop down to around 24 to 28 degrees Celsius. And these temperatures on both the hot side and the cold side is going to be a sufficient temperature gradient for your pet hognose snake. Now, regarding air temperature, you should try and achieve an air temperature of around 20 to 28 degrees Celsius, which is 68 to 82 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, in order to test your air temperature, what I'd recommend doing is placing a small thermometer into your enclosure, but make sure that you put it in the enclosure in a shaded area and allow it to just sit there for a few hours, and this will give you a good true reading of what your air temperatures are actually reading. Now, as long as you're within this sort of range on both the hot side and the cool side, your hognose is going to be perfectly fine with this. Now, to test my temperatures, I would recommend getting one of these, which is an infrared thermometer gun. And what this does is it allows you to test the temperatures across the entire enclosure and not just one specific spot. Now, that's basically everything you need to know regarding their temperature. The next thing we're going to talk about is humidity. So for their humidity, you're ideally going to want to create a range of around 30 to 50% humidity. Please don't worry if this fluctuates slightly above or slightly below. This is just a general guideline. The next thing that we're going over is their substrate. Now, as we have already discussed, hognose snakes love to burrow and dig under the substrate. So our substrate needs to be able to provide this for them and allow them the opportunity to actually dig and burrow and create those little cave-ins under the ground. So in order to create a suitable substrate that's going to allow your hognose to be able to dig and burrow, there are a few ways of going about this. So the first way would be using the Arcadia Earth Mix Arid and mixing it with either the Leolife, or you could also mix it with play sand. I'd do a 70 to 30% ratio, 70% soil to the 30% play sand or Leolife. Alternatively, you could also use the Arcadia Earth Mix and mix it with this stuff, and this is excavator clay by Zoomed. Now, this is going to be great because once it dries out, it's going to hold those burrows a lot better under the ground, and this stuff is going to be perfect to use as a part of your substrate for your hognose snake. So once you have your substrate in your enclosure, the next thing that you're going to want to do is actually decorate that enclosure. So what I'd recommend doing is simply adding hides on both the hot side as well as the cold side. On top of that, I'd also recommend adding in a moist hide or a humid hide, just as somewhere for your snake to be able to go to whilst they're in shed. And this humid hide is going to be a lot more humid, and therefore they're going to be able to go to this area to help them remove their skin a lot easier. On top of that, you can also add in things like cork bark. They absolutely love cork bark. They love to go through it as well as climb over it. On top of that, you can also decorate the enclosure with some plants, whether that's live plants or fake plants. You could also cover the ground surface area with leaf litter. I'd also recommend adding in some branches. You can get cork bark branches. Oh, and also I'd highly recommend adding a water bowl into your enclosure to allow your Western hognose access to water for if it wants to drink. So once you've added all your bits and bobs into your enclosure and it's all nice and cluttered, this is basically your setup complete, and your enclosure is now ready for your pet hognose to move into. So the next thing that we're going to discuss is feeding. So for their feeding, I'd recommend feeding babies every 5 days, and as they move into the juvenile stage, you can move them on to once a week. Now, once they hit adulthood, I tend to move them onto a feeding cycle of 10 to 14 days between feeds. Now, hognose snakes don't really constrict their prey. They kind of just hoover it up like you can see here. And for their diet, in captivity, you'll mainly be feeding small mice or baby rats. but I'd highly recommend switching up their diet, not just sticking to one single thing. Now the reason being is that in the wild they will eat all sorts of different things, from small mice and rats, but also they'll consume things like frogs, even other small lizards, as well as different kind of eggs. So in captivity you can switch up their diet and feed them things like baby quails, even quail eggs, frog legs. You can even feed them small bits of fish, like small bits of salmon or something, as well as feeding them the mice and rats. And for US viewers, you could also feed them small lizards or even reptilinks. Now, by switching up their diet, not only will you provide some diversity to their diet, but they'll also get a range of different nutrients from you providing this diverse diet. So if you're able to switch their feed up, then I'd highly recommend you doing so, as it's going to be a beneficial thing to your pet hognose. Now, I will say that they can be a little bit fussy eaters sometimes. Not always though. I do find it tends to be more with the younger ones. But there are ways to get them eating again, which we won't be covering in this video. We're going to do a completely separate video for this. I thought it was worth mentioning. So that's pretty much everything that you need to know regarding feeding. The next thing we're going to touch on is brumation. Now, Western hognose snakes go through a brumation cycle, which occurs during the winter months towards the end of the year. As winter approaches, you'll likely find that your hognose will start slowing down a bit and even start refusing to eat. They can go off their food completely during hibernation until the warmer season in the new year. Now, when it actually comes to hibernation and getting them into this cycle, I'd recommend start reducing the hours of light for your snake as we go into the winter, and keep reducing it over the season. So for example, your lighting cycle throughout the summertime should be 12 hours on and 12 hours off. So when the winter season starts, you can slowly reduce the lighting period to 10 hours on, and then over a bit more time you can then reduce it down again to 8 hours on, and then again down to 6 hours on, and this usually will trigger them into the cycle. Alternatively, you can also take them out of their enclosure and put them into something different like a container and just manually hibernate them at around 10 degrees Celsius, which is 50 degrees Fahrenheit. This will also work too. But if you are considering getting a Western hognose, then just be aware that they do go through this cycle, and it's definitely something that you need to be prepared for with this. So that's basically everything that you need to know regarding their setup and their care requirements. Obviously, if you have any questions whatsoever, please feel free to drop us a comment and I'll make sure to get back to you. If you found this video helpful, make sure to drop us a like to let me know that you enjoyed the video, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and follow us on social media. And yeah, I shall see you in the next video.